Hello, everybody. It's Mr. Foley here, and today we are looking at colonial views of British acts, gaining perspective from different viewpoints. And this is going to be an assignment where we really review what happens with the British acts and why some colonists are okay with them and why some are not. And look at it from different viewpoints. A lot of times when it comes to the American Revolution, there's this assumption that all Americans wanted to go against the British and fight, and that wasn't necessarily true. Many different groups felt very differently about the British. So we're going to look at those different viewpoints. So here's our overview. For this assignment, you're going to be reviewing 4 British acts from 3 different perspectives. With each act, you'll analyze how 3 different groups of colonists would feel about the act and whether they would agree with the British or not. The goal of this assignment is to better understand these various groups of colonists, why they felt differently about the British. And while some felt that their rights were violated by the British and war was needed, others sided with the British. So, your instructions for this project. You're going to watch this video lecture, which you're doing right now, or you can look at this Google Slides, which will be in Google Classroom, and then you're going to work on filling out the sheet, Colonial Views of British Acts. So here's the worksheet. It is in Google Classroom, and we're going to look at 4 acts: the Proclamation Act, the Stamp Act, the Declaratory Act, and the Townshend Act. And with each of these, you have to choose, is your group, this group right now is the colonial merchants, for or against that act? And why do you think that is? Now, for each of these groups, you also have other information. On the worksheet, you can click right here, and that'll take you to the information about that group. So you kind of understand what that group's about, how they feel, things like that. So you'll use this information along with the information you're going to learn about the acts to figure out, would they have agreed with this or not? Okay, so let's go back here and we're going to start looking at each of these groups and how they would feel in this situation. So our first group are the colonial merchants. Now, the colonial merchants, they're selling items in the colonies, and so trade is very important for them. The year is 1776. You're a member of the Second Continental Congress. For the past 10 years, the British Parliament has passed many laws in the aftermath of the French and Indian War. Some of your fellow colonists question whether these laws are just. Your work is very important and will determine whether the colonies remain in the British Empire or declare their independence. So you're part of the Continental Congress, and you're deciding, should we go to war with Britain or not? And the first group here are the colonial merchants. Now, a few points about the colonial merchants. As I mentioned, they want to make money. They're selling goods. They felt that taxes on imports throughout the empire were necessary to protect the colonies. And so they felt some taxes on goods coming in is okay, because the British have to protect the ships coming into the colonies, and there may be some protection, that's okay. They felt taxing specific goods was wrong. So tax placed on specific goods to tax only the colonists was wrong. They didn't feel like you should have a tax on only things American colonists would use. They felt that that should be a tax that all people have. So they felt that the tax should be fair. Since the French and Indian War has ended, there's no need for a large contingent of British troops to remain in the colonies. You do not want British troops if you're a colonial merchant. When they're in the city, people get a little worried about them. Maybe less people will come to your business. And frankly, you just don't think they're necessary. The French and Indian War ended. It's over. So there's no threat now. So having troops just means that there's going to be more expenses and more taxes. And you want taxes low so you can sell goods for better prices. So you don't think there should be any more soldiers. And fourth, only the colonial assemblies have the right to directly tax the colonists. As a merchant, you feel, and this is very important, that only the assemblies should be able to tax the colonies. Britain doesn't get to decide to tax you. It should be colonists that make up those laws and decide on those taxes themselves. So, to review, taxes are okay if everybody's being taxed as a whole. You shouldn't have taxes that are just for the colonists that hurt others, that hurt them and not others. The French and Indian War is over, so get rid of the soldiers. They may be stopping business. They cost a lot of money, increase taxes. And the colonists should get to choose on taxation, not the British king. So that's your first group, the colonial merchants. Our second group, the Western Expansionists. So background's the same. These are going to be your people that are expanding out west. Now, out west back then is a little different than we know today. If you look at our map up here, out west is right here. It's near the coast. It's off the coast, but it's not much further, you know, it's no further than the Appalachian Mountains. So these are people that want to go out west to farm for the most part. Here's how they feel. You feel a large contingent of British troops is necessary to protect the colonies. Whereas the merchants don't want troops around, you feel that troops should be around because they're going to protect you. So you're okay with that. Second, however, you don't believe the British have the right to prevent colonists from settling in the West. You want to go out west. You want to go across the Appalachian Mountains, possibly, into territories like, you know, the Northwest Territory, which consisted of Wisconsin, Minnesota, some other territories too. So you want to go out west, and you don't think the British should be able to stop you. You are becoming more concerned with British interference in colonial affairs, such as taxing goods and placing restrictions on colonial assemblies. You're seeing more and more that the British are starting to take over government in the colonies. You're not a real big fan of that. You don't like that a whole lot, especially the taxing goods. You have to buy these goods because, you know, some of them you just can't make. And if the British are taxing them, that means that you're going to spend more money. And fourth, the colonies have been governing themselves for nearly 100 years just fine. You wish the colonies could just stay in control like they have in the past. So, the big viewpoints here. Number one, you feel that British troops are needed. However, you're worried about taxes becoming too high. You feel the British maybe are taking a little too much control, and you feel that the colonists have done a good job. You've been governing yourselves. It's worked fine. You just want to have the right to move out west, to have your farm, and to live your life. That's all you want. Now, group three are the Tories, or the British sympathizers. These are people that live in the colonies, but they're okay with the British being in control. A lot of times they may work with the British through trade in different ways, and so they basically support the British. So points that you're going to want to make if you're in this group. Number one, you're a loyal British subject. You believe that all colonists should act loyal to Britain. Britain is in control. The British king is your ruler, and so you feel that, yeah, you know, we need to follow the rules because that's our government. Colonial charters don't allow colonial assemblies to supersede the parliament. Supersede means go above. So you feel that the king and the parliament in Britain should have more power than these colonial assemblies, these, you know, Massachusetts' government or Virginia's government or whatever it might be. Members of parliament represent the interests of the colonists in government, have every right to make laws for the good of the colonists in the empire. Do you feel that the British government has the right to make laws to govern you because they're looking out for your interests? Fourth, the colonies are better off staying in the British Empire. They have too much to lose if they declare independence. You know that Britain flows through, or trade flows through Britain, and so you really need Britain. And so you feel that the American colonies have to stay in the British Empire. Otherwise, we're going to lose that trade network, we're going to lose protection, and you really want those. So in essence, you feel the British government should have control, and you feel that you need to stay in the empire so that Britain can protect you and you can continue to have trade. So that's group three, the Tories. Now on to the acts. Act 1, the Proclamation Act. This was a big one. The Western Expansionists really were interested in this one out of all those groups, but each group had their own opinions. So as we learn about this act, think about how would each group feel? Would they be for it, against it, and why would they feel like they did? So in 1763, the Proclamation Act was passed. Soon after the British passed the peace treaty with France, Parliament passed the Proclamation Act. This act temporarily prohibited colonists from crossing the Appalachian Mountains and settling in the rich Ohio Valley and other areas in the West. The British government claimed the law was intended to protect settlers from American Indian tribes who had not agreed to peace, and to sort out confusing land claims of several different colonies. The British claimed the act would only be temporary. So the British are saying that all the colonists that live in these colonies, you need to stay on this side of the Appalachian Mountains. And the reason for that is simple. This territory over here is where Native Americans live. And they're really concerned that if you move into that territory, there's going to be fights. And because of that, they're going to have to put more troops in place. And that could cause more taxes. And so what we see in this regard is that the British are saying you can't move over here. Now, what happened in the French and Indian War is that a lot of the colonists had fought against the the French in these territories. And now they are being told that they have to move back to the colonies. So think about, how would you feel if you had to fight over here and now the government's saying you have to go back over here? So some of these groups may be for this, some of them may be against. Think it through. Put yourself in the shoes of each group. Would the colonial merchants be okay with this? Would they not? Would they not really care? How would Western expansionists feel about this? And how would the Tories feel? That's Act 1, Proclamation Act. Act 2, the Stamp Act. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act to raise revenue to pay for the debts incurred during the French and Indian War. So the British came in and brought all kinds of soldiers into the colonies to fight against the French, and they said that they were protecting the colonists. And this costs a lot of money. And so now the British feel that they have the right to get that money back. And how does the government get money? Taxes. So they decided to do what's called the Stamp Act. And this law applied a direct tax on printed materials such as newspapers, official documents, and playing cards. A stamp had to be purchased to show proof of having paid the tax. So now the colonists, when they go in to buy a newspaper or an official document, a birth certificate, whatever it was, or like something like playing cards, when you buy that, you also have to pay this British stamp tax, and it's additional money. And so you can imagine for the merchants, those selling goods, this is going to increase the price of a lot of their goods, and maybe some people won't buy as many. For the colonists themselves, whenever they buy something, it's more expensive, and they don't like that. So yeah, the British will get a tax here, but the colonists don't feel real great about it. And you can see in this picture right here, an angry mob protests against the Stamp Act by carrying a banner reading "The Folly of England, the Ruin of America" through the streets of New York. Colonists weren't necessarily real excited about it. The big question comes, does the British government have the right to tax the colonists? And the British government here is obviously saying, yes, we do. And the colonists don't necessarily feel the same way. Act 3, the Declaratory Act, 1766. So the king makes it very clear where the colonists stand in this act. So, Parliament declared that the colonies in America have been and are, and of right ought to be, subordinate and dependent upon the imperial crown and Parliament of Great Britain. It further stated the king and Parliament had full power and authority to make laws that should bind the colonies and its people as subject of the British crown, and that any laws passed in the colonies that conflicted with the laws of Parliament were null and void. They were not legal. And so basically, the King of Britain and the Parliament, their representative group, are saying to the colonies, look, we get to tax you however we want to, and we get to make whatever laws we want to that you're going to have to follow. You don't necessarily get a say. Now, you can have your colonial assembly, you can make local laws, but if they go against the British king or the Parliament and their laws, your laws don't count. And so I love this picture here. It's basically like King George III saying, I say I can pass any law on you lot, and there's not a thing you can do about it. So think about that. How are these groups going to feel? The colonial merchants, the expansionists, the Tories, how are they going to feel when the king and the Parliament are saying, listen, colonists, you have to do what we say? 4, the Townshend Acts. Okay, so here's what we have going on here. 1767. Parliament passed the Townshend Act, which taxed glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea, all products that had to be exported. The tax was a tariff paid by the shippers, with the cost passed along to consumers and as an indirect tax. So if you look at these, tea, paint, paper, these kind of things, these are all things that they had to buy from Britain or other countries under the British Crown because they didn't make them in the colonies. And so people had to buy these, and now the British are taxing them, which means that, you know, maybe that paint you got, we'll say, cost £5. Well, maybe with the tax, it costs £7. So for the merchants, we see that it's going to, you know, everything's going to be more expensive that they sell. They're not making any more money off of it. For the colonists, all goods are going to become more expensive that are shipped in. So I'll continue reading. This act also set up customs courts to enforce laws against smuggling. These courts were not always open to the public and had no juries. To ensure that suspected smugglers were punished, some customs officials brought unsubstantiated claims against the accused and compelled witnesses to testify against them. People were imprisoned under these charges. And so we see some situations where people are buying goods from France or from another country. In the colonies, that was illegal. They were only allowed to buy goods from Britain. Well, now the goods from Britain just became more expensive, and they don't like that. So if they try to smuggle goods in from France and get them illegally, they could be charged for that and put in jail or imprisoned. And sometimes the British brought charges against people with witnesses that kind of made up their story. They weren't even necessarily a witness of it. So overall, on the bottom, what it means. Goods can only be purchased from Great Britain. If you purchase them from other countries, that was illegal and punishable by law, and the prices of the goods in the colonies would increase. So how are the merchants going to feel, Western expansionists and the Tories, about this law? Would they agree with it or would they not? So now that you have this background information, you can go over to your worksheet and go through each of these different sections and decide how would they feel and why would they feel that way. If you have any questions, talk to your teacher and we can go from there. Have a great day, everybody.